Welcome into this week's episode of Three True Values. As always, I am your host, James Fletcher. We're back for week 2 of our conference preview slate. This week, we're going to be taking you through the Pac-12 Conference here in this first segment. Then we'll take a break. When we come back, we're going to talk to Nick Schultz of On3. He's kind of my insider, my go-to guy when it comes to all things Missouri Valley Conference and now the Atlantic 10, as he used to cover Loyola Chicago, who has now made that conference move from one to the other. So we'll talk to him about both of those conferences. We're going to knock out 2 conferences. In the third segment, we're going to go through the Missouri Valley and the Atlantic 10. So we got a big jam-packed show for you here today. We're going to start by taking you through the Pac-12, which has seen a lot of shakeup, as we know, now primarily due to football reasons, but it's going to impact basketball as well as all the other sports. The Pac-12 will no longer be in its current format beyond this season. So this is the final go-around of this version of the Pac-12, which includes Arizona, Oregon, UCLA, and USC. You've got Washington, Colorado, Arizona State, Utah, Stanford, and Cal even now leaving. The only 2 who will be coming back next year, Washington State and Oregon State. And what format that ends up being in, still to be determined. Will they bring in schools from the Mountain West? Will they merge with schools from across the country? Will they be invited into one of these power conferences that we've come to know? Or, and this again, everything gets intertangled in the world of college sports. Football is the money driver, as we know. And so right now, with the current college football playoff format, and I know you're thinking, this is a college basketball podcast, what are we talking about here? There is an incentive for those 2 teams to maintain the Pac-12 name, which has an automatic bid for the conference champion into the new 12-team format of the college football playoff. In theory, those 2 teams, until something happens with that group of commissioners when they meet to discuss the future of the college football playoff, this will likely change in some form. We don't know how yet, though, or how many votes they need to get this done. So, could Washington State and Oregon State, until that gets settled, attempt to be a 2-team league in the interest of getting one of those 2 teams into the college football playoff? I think it's all out there on the table right now. We will see how it all plays out throughout the course of the next year. But for right now, it's time to lock in. It's time to give you a Pac-12 preview. This year, at the top of the conference, I've got Arizona. I've got Arizona with what they bring in from the transfer portal by way of Caleb Love, Jaden Bradley, Keyshawn Johnson. I think that they've got a lot there. Kylan Boswell returns for another season, as do Pele Larson and Umar Ballo. KJ Lewis is a freshman incoming. I just think that they're really stacked well for Tommy Lloyd and his group to put the pieces together this year. Jaden Bradley, a guy that I know well from his time at Alabama, covered last year quite a bit. I like him. I like his game and how it can mold based on who he's out there with. I think when he plays with Caleb Love, he can play a little bit differently than when he plays with Kylan Boswell. And so I like his ability to fit in that backcourt with either of those 2 guys. And of course, Caleb Love, Arizona becomes the benefactor of some transfer portal drama as he enters from North Carolina, one of the biggest names to go into the transfer portal this offseason. And then a lot of reports had him with at least a large amount of interest in going to Michigan. However, there were reports about admissions, whether he was able to enroll at that school. In the end, he decommits from Michigan, ends up at Arizona. So how he ended up there, how any of these players ended up there, like we can talk about it however we want. But the fact of the matter is they ended up with 3 guys out of the transfer portal who were highly sought after, if you include Keyshawn Johnson. And so I like that the way that they fit together. I think that they've got players at the guard position. I think they've got good wings. I think they've got a good big man. I think that it really all just comes together for this Arizona group. Second, I think that there's a big cluster there. 3, probably 4 teams in that group. I'm going to go with 3 for now. I think in that group, and I'm not going to try to separate them in terms of who is second, who is third, and who is fourth, because it's really close to call at this point in the season. But Oregon, I think a lot of people are sleeping on them because a couple of down years. We look and we think it's a good roster, and then they don't achieve to the standard that we're expecting. But this is a team that brings in Kario Kindo, a really good scoring guard out of the transfer portal. They bring in 2 outstanding forwards in the freshman class with Kwame Evans and Mookie Cook. You add that to 2 big men returning in Vale Dante and Nate Biddle. Can Nate Biddle live up to the 5-star hype that he had coming from high school? We haven't really seen him translate much of that potential, much of what all of those scouts saw from him into the college game. I think that this is his year to prove it. He's still there. We've seen a lot of guys who struggle as highly rated guys. They take that step down. They say, let me try to rebuild my stock or just get playing time because they're struggling. They're trying to figure out who they are in the college game. Nate Biddle stays at Oregon, and I think this is his chance to really assert himself as that top shelf player. Of course, beyond that, you bring back Keyshawn Bartholomew and Jermaine Quiznard to the backcourt. I think that they're a really good pairing. I think there were health issues there that kind of set back Oregon throughout the season. They could never really gel. That whole unit really never gelled the way it was supposed to. And then the wild card for Oregon, I think what can take them from the second tier to a potential contender against Arizona at the top of this conference is the potential emergence of Jackson Shellstad. Another guard, a guy who can run the offense and who I think, based off where he's ranked, those guys who are between 20 and 50, that's kind of one of the widest ranges you're going to see of players. Some of those guys are going to turn into one-and-done players, guys who end up in the lottery of the upcoming NBA draft. Some of them will underachieve. They'll stick around, hopefully have good college careers by the time they get to years 2, 3, and 4. And so what is he from that group of the recruiting class? Which of those paths will he take? I think that's going to be a big factor for Oregon this season. Boogie Ellis, of course, leads the way. He'll probably be the preseason favorite to win Player of the Year in this conference. We'll get to that later, though. And he's accompanied in that backcourt by Isaiah Collier, the number 1 freshman in the class. So we talk about a backcourt. I think this is the number 1 backcourt in the conference coming into things today. Oh, and let's not forget that barring any more medical decisions from doctors, we could see Bronny James also play a role off the bench more than likely, especially now, missing camp, missing these practices. I think Bronny James's role likely comes off the bench, at least at the start of this season, until he's able to get things going. Kobe Johnson returns. That's big for them. Joshua Morgan will lock down that center spot. Could move to the power forward if Iwuchukwu is able to emerge. And then DJ Rodman, a nice rotation piece, a guy who they can put into the starting lineup, move out of the starting lineup, whatever they need to do with him, he's going to do it at a high level. A guy from Washington State, and so it's an addition to USC, also a subtraction from one of their rivals. That double whammy there plays a role in the conference landscape. And UCLA, probably the biggest unknown in all of college basketball. You heard me right. I have no idea what this UCLA team will do. I think they could be a Final Four team. I think they could miss the NCAA tournament. And the reason that there's so much of a wide gap in how I view this team, it's not because of Adembona, who returns, or Will McClendon, who comes back to UCLA. It has to do with 2 things. One, they lost so much off of last year's roster. Of course, Tiger Campbell, the point guard. You lose Jalen Clark. I think that in addition to that, you lose more pieces to the NBA draft, to graduation, to the transfer portal. And you're kind of starting not from scratch, because as I said, they bring back a couple of good pieces here. But they bring in a lot of unknowns this season as well. Freshman Sebastian Mack, I think he'll be good for them. I think he'll be a good guard piece for this team. But then you bring in Lazar Stefanovic. What does he look like in the system? But beyond those players, there's 3 guys on this team that make them the most interesting team in all of college basketball. That would be Ade Mara, Jan Vide, and Burke Buyung-Tunsel. Okay? And apologies if I messed up that last name. I did my best there with the letters provided to me. He is a Turkish player. Ade Mara, a Spanish player. And these guys are coming in. They're not ranked by the recruiting services, or if they are, they were added into the databases late, and they're not in every database, so you can't get an accurate rating. We see all these consensus ratings across all the recruiting services. They don't have that. They're not in those systems in that same way. And so you can't compare Ade Mara to Kwame Evans as the scouts have listed the 2 of them. Now, we can look at where they were projected in the NBA draft if they were to come out last year, or where they're projected to go in the NBA draft next year. But those projections vary widely and also aren't necessarily determined based on how good a player is going to be at the college level. Look no further than Oscar Tshiebwe, Hunter Dickinson. Those guys, incredible college basketball players, but they were never projected in the first round of the NBA draft. So, how much can these guys offer UCLA? It's a complete unknown. Anyone trying to tell you otherwise, they're fooling you, because I've seen some tape on these guys. They play very well in the European game. But if anyone watched the World Basketball Championships, the World Cup this summer, you know that it's not the same as the NBA game everywhere across the world. There's different ways that the game is officiated, different styles of play. You've got all kinds of things that go into the translation between the European game and the American game. Now you throw on top of that they're coming to the United States and enrolling in classes at UCLA. So there's a lot going on here at UCLA, and I just am not ready to make any sort of prediction at all about what they're going to be. As we move into the next tier, there's 3, I think, that have a chance. They're these border teams. We talk about them in every conference, and we're going to keep doing it. Could be in the NCAA tournament, could miss the NCAA tournament. These are the bubble teams right here. Adam Miller comes to Arizona State. Can he overcome the injuries that have sidelined him throughout large chunks of his career at Illinois and LSU? He's looked really good when he's on the floor. Can he bring that to Arizona State and stay healthy this season? Sean Phillips comes in at center. What can he offer the Sun Devils? Kamari Lands also comes in. They join Jemiah Neal, Braylon Green, Alonzo Gaffney, Akil Watson. This is a team that's got the depth to do it. But Arizona State, it feels like every year you just kind of wonder how the pieces are going to fall into place. Are they going to become a team? If they can do that, they'll be in the NCAA tournament as high, I think, as a potential 6th seed. Colorado, a large unknown here. They bring in freshman Cody Williams, who across the recruiting services, maybe one of the wider spread of opinions on what he is. Some people believe he's the best player in the class. Others think that he's way more of a project and he's really just not there yet. He's going to be accompanied at the forward spot with Tristan da Silva, and they bring in Eddie Lampkin from TCU to play the center position. Hassan Diop also likely will come off the bench. He's a freshman, an intriguing guy, somebody who could develop into a real rim protector as the season goes on. And so what else can they get from the rest of those guys on that roster? The Luke O'Briens, the KJ Simpsons, Javon Hadley. More and more as you go down the line. Who's going to step up and turn this into an NCAA tournament team? Or can they be carried by those 3 guys at the forward spots and at center? We'll see as the season goes on. And Washington, who I think has the highest upside in this group, because you go through the names and you start to wonder, you think Severe Wheeler, okay, things turned sour for him at the end at Kentucky. but he was good at Georgia. He was good at Kentucky at the start. Can he transfer that to Washington? What can he bring this team? Paul Mulkey, he comes in from Rutgers. I mean, he's proven it year after year in the Big Ten that he can be a dynamic player. Keon Brooks, I think one of the most underrated returning players in the Pac-12 this year is Keon Brooks. I don't think enough people are talking about what he did last season and what he can do this season with better talent around him, with Moses Wood. They've also got Frank Kepnong in there. Wesley Yates, a freshman, top 50 freshman coming in. Nate Kalmise, a transfer guard who had interest from all across the country in his services. So this is a really interesting team. What can they do this year? As you keep going down, I think Utah probably the next most interesting of the potential teams that could jump out. Maybe they reach that bubble status by the end of the year. I mean, Devin Smith, Cole Bahama, Ben Carlson, Brandon Carlson, and Lawson Lovering. That's a pretty good group. How well will they mesh? How do they complement each other? We'll see as the season goes on. Washington State, Stanford, Cal, Oregon State. I really just don't see it. And I know some people will push back on Stanford. They'll say, look, they got Kanan Carlisle coming in, Michael Jones, Spencer Jones coming back, Jared Bynum, Andres Stojakovic. I mean, the son of a legend in the NBA. I can't believe that a team that struggled with Zaire Williams on the roster, then struggled with Harrison Ingram on the roster, is going to get the most out of Stojakovic and Carlisle in one season. I just don't see it. And so, excuse me for not putting them into that conversation. I think that Washington State probably going to struggle. Cal is an interesting one, though. Cal brings in a lot of transfers. Keontae Kennedy, Jalen Tyson, Fardaz Amik, Jalen Cone, Devin Askew comes back. This is a team that I don't see how the pieces fit together, but if they do, you could be talking about a team that at the very least can poach one of those bubble spots away from their competition once we get to Pac-12 tournament time. Oregon State, I put them at the bottom of this list. I don't see much on that roster. I think that there was that mirage of a season where they got hot in the Pac-12 tournament, got hot in the NCAA tournament, and it really papered over a lot of cracks in that program that I think finally are going to just catch up to them and really make this a make or break decision-making year for Oregon State's basketball program. What is the future there? Do they find a new coach? Can they find a new coach without the Pac-12 in its current form to draw in those mid-major coaches? What does that look like? We'll have to wait and see. But this year, I'm going with Boogie Ellis as the Conference Player of the Year. Isaiah Collier, my Freshman of the Year. Transfer of the Year, I'm going to go with – it's going to be close. I'm telling you, there's some really good transfers in this conference. I'm just going to go Caleb Love over Mulkey and Keontae Kennedy. Coach of the Year, give me Tommy Lloyd. But I think that Andy Enfield could make a real run at that. And don't overlook Tad Boyle, because if this Colorado team starts to make that climb, he's going to be right up at the top of that list. When we come back, we'll be talking to Nick Schultz about two mid-major conferences right here on 3 True Values. Welcome back into 3 True Values as we keep rolling through our conference previews here. We've got the foremost expert in my mind on all things Missouri Valley, and now he's also an expert on all things A-10 as he follows his Loyola Chicago team, which made that conference transition just not too long ago. We got Nick Schultz from On3 with us here to discuss some of the mid-major teams that you should look out for this upcoming season. Nick, how you doing?
Fletch, I'm doing great, man. It's weird having the double conferences to follow now. Like Missouri Valley used to be like my main focus. And now like, wow, I've got to pay attention to Dayton and George Washington. Kind of been a weird year.
Yeah, it got expanded out. I know we talked about these two conferences last year, and we raised an interesting question that I think actually played out. I think it aged really well. I wish we could just replay it and just, have all the fans applaud us for how well we predicted how that A-10 season would go with all of the changes in that conference, how everything was going to be different, and then how when it didn't necessarily go the way that the predictions had called for, we saw a lot of changes within the conference, transfer exits, transfers coming in, and this conference feels like a whole new landscape. And I know you're locked in on Loyola Chicago, had probably one of their most disappointing seasons in anyone's memory of Loyola Chicago since they burst onto the scene. Where are they now, and what do you see from them this season?
So last year reminded me a lot of probably my freshman year at Loyola, which was the year before they went to the Final Four. And the record didn't reflect that year. Like that year, my freshman year, they were the 5th seed, which was their highest seed Missouri Valley tournament at the time. To put it in perspective, how that run, that little stretch was, they had never been higher than a 5 seed Missouri Valley tournament before the Final Four run. But the way last year reminded me of it, a lot of transition, a lot of new faces coming in, and they lost a lot of leadership from the year before. And I think last year, the conference jump, it was one of those on paper. You're going to make the transition fine. You've got the talent. But once you play the games, you realize, hey, the A-10, they're playing fast. They're long. They're going to stretch the floor out more than we thought. And I think the learning curve was bigger than everybody. I'm talking like from a fan perspective. I think it was bigger than everybody expected. But I think what Drew Valentine and the staff did, and he changed his entire staff. There's a lot of turnover. I think Sean Dwyer's the only one who's left. Like Amaro Morgan went to Cal. Patrick Wallace went to Iona. And you've got a new staff in there. And you've got a lot of new faces again. But you've also got some core guys from last year, like Phil Alston. He came out of D2. He was their best player. Braden Norris is back. You lost Marquise Kennedy, but he was kind of up and down last year. You've got Demi Adelakun coming in. You've got Des Watson, an A-10 transfer coming in. It feels like they addressed the areas of need. And I talked to Drew last week, the Chicagoland tip-off. There was the media with every Chicagoland school except UIC. They couldn't make it. And he seemed very confident. And a confident Drew Valentine is not a good thing if you're an opposing team, because Drew wants to win. And I think he wants to win even more this year, because last year, last in the A-10, not how anyone thought it would go. They're out to prove something this year. And I think if they can make all these new faces fit together, they've got a lot of transfers, one freshman, to put it in perspective. They're playing with a chip on their shoulder this year. And that's going to be something I'm watching for sure. I don't think they're going to finish last again. Let me make that clear. Middle of the pack, I could see that.
Right. And I do think that it comes at the right time, because you've got an A-10 that's got some transition happening within it. You've got some players who were kind of staples of that conference. They're now gone. I'm thinking specifically of Tyler Burton, a guy who now at Villanova, he exits. He would have been in the Conference Player of the Year conversation. Absolutely. You've got a St. Louis team that last year had such high projections. So many had high hopes for them. They didn't really live up to much of that. So now can they do something different this year? VCU now has a new coach. They lose Ace Baldwin. And so there's turnover at the top of this conference. But it seems like the one team that got everything back that they needed probably was Dayton. You get back to Ron Holmes, Anthony Grant, still your coach. Are they kind of the runaway favorite to take this conference? Or can one of those teams adjust to the changes and give them a run this season?
I would say right now, if you had to pick, Dayton's the favorite. Like, there's no question. I don't think, I don't know if they're a runaway necessarily, because just with all the changes, it's hard to predict, is there a runaway? I mean, last year, the A-10, it was the best way, and I think I said it at the time with you, it was a weird year.
Yeah. Like,
that's just the best way to put it. It was a weird year. Where did George Washington come from last year? Like, I think that Chris Caputo has done an amazing job at GW, and I think they're going to keep that going this year. They did a good job on the recruiting trail too. So I think they're like a sleeper team. I wouldn't pick them to win the league, necessarily right now, but I think they can make some noise and maybe make things tough for, a Dayton or any of those teams toward the top. But I think what Dayton's got coming back, I mean, you look at some of the previews here, like you got Deron Holmes is the biggest name you've got coming back for sure. I think that's huge. And the guys at the Almanac put him on the first team all-conference preseason team. That hasn't come out yet.
Yeah.
VCU, that's an intriguing team this year, I'd say. And don't sleep on Bonaventure either. Like Bonaventure's going to be, like, I'm not going to count out Bonaventure ever, but they're toward the top of these projections too this year. And that's another team that I saw them firsthand last year. They played Loyola. That team's good. I mean, they lost the game, but that's a team I wouldn't want to play on a weeknight.
Right. And you look down that conference, you've also got Davidson. Fordham had a really good year last year. I think it'll be interesting to see if they can repeat that success. But you've got so many players coming into this conference or returning who are up at the top in that player of the year conversation. I really like, we mentioned him already, Deron Holmes. I think he'd probably be my favorite, but I'm not going to sleep on Josh Cohen, Eric Reynolds, James Bishop. There feels like there's so many people at the top of this conference who are ready to show that they're that next mid-major player who's going to become a national storyline.
Yeah, and I think with the A-10 too, I don't consider the A-10 like a true mid-major. I think they're kind of like, you've got your power conferences, you've got your mid-majors. I put the A-10 with like the Big East and the American, and the Big East you can call a power conference. Mm-hmm. I think the A-10 and the American are like kind of in that in between there, where you've got years where they play like a power league. You got years like last year where they kind of maybe fell into the mid-major.
Yeah.
But this year, after that year like last year, you've got guys who are going to want to say, hey, this is our league. We're going to get back to a multi-bid league. Because all the projections last year, bracketologists, A-10 is going to be 2-bid league. You only got one bid, and you needed the automatic bid to do it.
Right.
Like and I think adding Loyola was an interesting ripple because you expanded again. Like that's not easy to do. When you expand, you've got to accommodate for that. You've got another team you're playing. A lot of unknowns, and obviously Loyola finished last, but that's still a factor in this. And like those names you mentioned, I think Darryl Banks at Bonaventure too. Watch out for. I really like Bonnie this year. I don't know why. I'm a big fan. St. Louis. That's Yuri Collins gone. That's a big departure. That's a big one. I know he didn't necessarily play, up to expectations last year necessarily, but expectations were really, really high. He's still a very good player. So it's going to be a unique year in terms of the amount of talent that can emerge, what talent's going to stick around, like what names don't you know that you're going to see? And I don't have any right now just because, again, there's so many new faces. Yeah, definitely. And now as we transition over to the Missouri Valley, I think they also have a team that's kind of up at the top. And then you've got a lot of movers and shakers in the middle there that some are going to be better this year. Some are going to be worse this year than they were. I think it's Drake at the top. But after Drake, can Murray State, that's the team I'm looking at. Can they bounce back? Because they had one of those uncharacteristic down years where everyone kind of said, wait, was it just Matt McMahon? Is that what that program was built on? Or is Murray State in that class of mid-major teams that can go to the tournament year in and year out? I'm never going to count out Murray State just because of what they did under McMahon. I know he's gone. They got Steve Prohm back, and I'm never going to count him out just because of the history there. You also have to, again, the Missouri Valley is a grind. Mm-hmm. And it's not – there's a reason there was so much parity after Wichita State left and when, Loyola made the run. But there was always a lot of parity. I would put the standings out after every game, and it was tight. I remember years where third place and seventh place were separated by like a game and a half, 2 games.
Yeah.
Like it's a tough league to play no matter where you're coming from. So that was, I think, a year like that for them.
Yeah.
Drake's still the class of the league. Tucker DeVries is special. And I don't want to say the reason he stayed at Drake is because of his dad, but I'm sure that's like why when you hear all these guys going into the portal, you didn't hear anyone think Tucker DeVries was leaving because his dad was there and his dad stuck around.
Does it remind you of another former, well, at the time, Missouri Valley father-son duo, the McDermotts? Like, does it remind you in that way of how dominant he is above the class of the rest of this conference, but he's still there, and everyone kind of knows it's because his dad's there? Yeah.
No, I could see that comparison for sure, and I always got a soft spot for Dougie McBuckets. I mean, he's a bull. Dougie McBuckets is a bull.
Yes, he was.
So I've got a soft spot always, and I think Tucker DeVries would have been one of those guys because the Valley saw he was the only first teamer to stick around. Everyone else went in the portal. It's second year in a row that's happened, by the way. They got absolutely decimated by the transfer portal.
Right.
And having Tucker DeVries stick around, Drake's the favorite in that league for sure. I'm curious to see how Bradley does this year.
Yeah.
Just what's Brian Wardle able to do? Is he gonna be able to keep this thing going? They had a solid year last year, and the landscape in that league is changing just because they got hit so hard by the portal for the second year in a row, and that's something. As the landscape as the dust settles, what's the Missouri Valley going to look like? Because I feel like they've gotten hit one of the hardest in terms of the portal. I've been looking for the numbers. I can't break down the numbers and don't feel like going through every league to figure that out. But man, that's 2 years in a row. You lost almost your entire first team.
Yeah. And you've got, I think the other team that I'm watching from that conference is Belmont, which you just have to. The way that they play basketball, they're going to be a tough out no matter when you play them, where you play them. And that team has proven over and over that despite losing some players, despite those transfers heading out, they're able to kind of plug and play with that system that they run. This year, obviously, I think I would have had them up there, maybe compete with Drake if they had just been able to hold on to Ben Shepherd, if they had just been able to keep him. But that NBA draft water it's too tempting not to take. And obviously he ends up going high enough that it was worth it for him. And now he's on to his pro career, but now Belmont got to replace that hole. And I think it's one of the interesting areas that we've talked about, the transfer portal, and so many people thought it was going to ruin college sports, right? All of the best players are just going to go to the best teams. Well, we've seen that happen. The Missouri Valley, a great example. Like you said, these top players are just entering, figuring out what next level they can go to, what next step they can take. But what we're also seeing is these teams in the Missouri Valley, they're able to get the disgruntled 4-star from the team that level up who now wants playing time. He sees a gap. He sees how that last guy performed. Now he's going to do it at this level. You also get the guy from D2, the lower divisions, other teams where he's disgruntled or he has proven that he's better than his level of competition. Now they're coming up. And I think across most of the college sports landscape, it's creating parity. People don't want to admit it. They don't want to talk about it. Even in college football, and I know there's a basketball podcast, but everyone says, oh, there's parity this year. And they kind of scratch their head. Why is there parity? What happened? The transfer portal is what happened to create that parity. And the sooner that we can all realize that, the sooner we can accept that this new era of college sports is actually pretty great.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. There's two sides to the portal. You're going to lose some good players if you're a mid-major. You're going to lose some of your best players if they end up, I don't want to say poach, but that's the word everyone uses. But you also have an opportunity if you've got a guy, let's say you've got a guy from Michigan or I think Valpo did this with Wisconsin. Wisconsin had a player, I can't remember his name off the top of my head. Played at Wisconsin, didn't play much, went to Valpo, took the step down, was one of their key players under Matt Loddick, who's obviously no longer there, which I thought should have happened sooner. But you got guys like that. That's the other side of the portal. And I've talked to Drew about this. I've talked to other Valley coaches about this over the last couple of years. The other side of the portal is we can go get some really good talent and inject some instant impact right away. Right. So that's the part from the mid-major standpoint. It's a two-way street there. You're going to lose some, but there's going to be some really good players available.
Yeah, for sure. And it'll be interesting to see how those new players coming in perform, tracking some of those old players who are now at their new destinations. And these two conferences, they always interest me. And so that's why I'm glad we can talk to you every year about what we need to know in these two conferences. And I want to thank you for coming on to the show this week and letting us know everything you know about those two conferences. Why don't you let them know where they can keep up with you and your work as you cover these teams and everything else that you cover there at On3?
Well, it's always a pleasure coming out and talking to you, Fletch. I appreciate the invitation. I'm on Twitter at Nick Schultz _7. I active at On3. College football season now, but we're almost to college hoops. We're almost there. A month away. Right at a month. Yeah. So this is coming quick. November is going to be a really fun month. So full coverage at On3. I also do a Bulls podcast on Believe Network. We're going to be every Tuesday and Friday with CJ Watson for the second year in a row. And going to be a lot of things going on, but I can't wait for hoops. I need some positivity. My football teams are doing well.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks for coming on the show. When we come back, We'll talk more about these two conferences. Welcome back into Three True Values. I want to thank Nick Schultz once again for coming on the program. Had fun talking with him. Always have fun. He's starting to become a regular on the show. We'll see if we can get him on either later in the season or, of course, this time next year. We're going to have to bring him in to talk more about these conferences. But let's go ahead and get into it. We talked a lot with him about these two conferences, so I'm not going to go super in-depth on players the way that I have in some of these other bigger conferences. I do want to talk just generally about a couple of the teams. Dayton, as I said in that segment, they're up at the top to me. I think that next tier, St. Louis, VCU, Davidson, St. Bonaventure, they're right there. This next tier is a prove-it year to me. I think that if they can assert themselves and have the seasons they had last year, then okay, I got to put you in that second tier with VCU, Davidson, St. Bonaventure, where I'm looking for continued success. That includes Fordham, George Mason, and George Washington. And then you round out the rest of the conference. I think St. Joe's, UMass and Duquesne, Loyola Chicago, LaSalle. I think Richmond struggles with what they lost this season. And then I think Rhode Island, again, ever since they lost some of their best players to the transfer portal a couple of years ago, they've just really struggled to get back to that point that they were. When we talk about the player of the year conversation, I think it starts and stops with De'Ron Holmes. I think that there's a couple of guys, James Bishop, Josh Cohn, Eric Reynolds, who maybe can work their way into that conversation. But I think that it's De'Ron Holmes' award to lose at this point. Marvell Allen, I think the top freshman coming into this conference. Josh Cohen's who I'm going to go with as the transfer of the year here. I think that his scoring is not talked about enough. The way that he plays the game, I think it's going to translate really well in this Atlantic 10 conference. Woody Newton also has a chance to break out. I think Micah Adams-Woods in that conversation too. And I'm going to just go with Anthony Grant, the safe pick, as coach of the year. The Missouri Valley, Drake up at the top. We talked about it. The DeVries family, they run this conference until one or both of them moves on to greener pastures. Bradley, Belmont, Indiana State, Murray State. There's a large group here that I'm going to put in the second tier. You know what? We're going to throw Northern Iowa in there too, because we've seen them have great success over recent years. Not last year, but can they bounce back? Can Murray State bounce back? Can Belmont stay where it's been? Can Bradley stack years together? How about Indiana State? Really sneaky good last season. And I think the next tier, you've got Valpo looking to come back to that prominence that they held for so many years. They are trying to rebuild that program pretty much from the ground up at this point. Southern Illinois, Missouri State, Illinois State. We'll wait and see what they are as we get into the season. And I think at the bottom, you've got UIC and Evansville kind of at the tail end of that conference. No offense to those two programs. I just don't see it on their roster right now. Don't see it in that program to have a big leap this season. Tucker DeVries is going to be the player of the year pick here. I think his dad, you got to go with for coach of the year as well. And that is going to bring us to a close this week as we finish talking about the Pac-12, the Atlantic 10, and the Missouri Valley conferences. I hope you enjoyed talking about these three conferences. If you haven't checked out our first episode, I encourage you, go back, listen to it. A lot of insightful stuff on the Big 12. Then we talked to Joe Cook of Inside Texas about what the Longhorns have cooking this season. And then we talked Big East in the third segment. We're going to come back next week. We're going to have this same exact format, so you're not going to want to miss it. Next week, we will be talking Big 10 and a couple other conferences. It's to be determined which conferences we're going to talk about. They will be mid-majors in that the third segment after we finish talking about the big conference. Do a quick interview, get you more inside information. We'll wrap up with a mid-major. So I'm James Fletcher. Please tune in again next week for Three True Values.